Well, welcome to Vindolanda, everybody. My name is Justin Blake. I'm Deputy Director of Excavations for the Vindolanda Trust here. And really what I'm going to try and do is tell you a little bit about what we've been finding in this area in the last 18 months of work or so. But to be honest with you, it isn't going to make any sense whatsoever unless I give you a little bit of context and explain a little bit about the background to the site to begin with. So you can bear with us for 5 or 10 minutes or so. I'll try and fill the little background details in, and hopefully that should set the stage quite nicely to make this come alive a little bit for you. And I think probably the most important thing that I can tell anybody about the site really is that what you can see on the ground today is only just the tip of the iceberg at Vindolanda in terms of archaeology. And the reason for that is that during the Roman occupation of the site they actually built 9 different forts here. And the 9 forts are all buried superimposed on top of each other, the first 7 of which are made in timber, and it's only the last 2 that are made in stone. So if we wind back the clock to around about 1972-73, my old boss at the time, Robin Burley, he didn't know any of this. He just thought there was one Roman fort built in stone. He knew it was 3rd century in date from an inscription that they'd found beside the south gateway of the fort. We knew that it was built by the 4th cohort of Gaul, so it was a 500 strong auxiliary garrison. And Robin in 1972 pretty made a sensible estimation that given a team of about 5 or 6 relatively skilled archaeologists, he would be able to analyse all of Vindolanda, dig it all out of the ground, present it to the public for display, and pretty much understand the site within about 25 years. And to be honest with you, that wasn't a bad estimation. But in the course of work in around, it was about 1973-74, we had a tremendously wet spell in around about late May, early June. Visitors were complaining when they came to the site they were spoiling their shoes, and because the ground was that wet to come in to see the archaeology, that Robin decided, right, we'd better do something about this and put a drain in. So we went down underneath the latest stone level, and it was in the course of that drainage work that he came across Roman timbers, he came across leather boots and shoes, all sorts of other earlier Roman artefacts, and of course the light bulb came on quite quickly, and he thought, right, clearly we've got an earlier level that we hadn't got a clue was here a couple of weeks ago, but if there's one, there may be more. So we widened his trench out a little bit, got a date of mid-2nd century for that, and went down a bit deeper and found that sure enough we had an earlier level still. So having got that, it must be more, so we dug down a little bit further and eventually ran out of archaeology at, like I say, 24 feet. So you'll excuse us if the divergence of research then took a monumental U-turn, and it would take us the next sort of 25-30 years really to analyse those earlier levels and try and work out exactly what sort of longevity of occupation we had at the site and exactly who was doing what. And it's really only now that we've come back to where we were in the early 1970s and looking at the later Roman period. So essentially what we found in that intervening period was that our first fort here actually predated Hadrian's Wall by a good 43 years. Now, I'm fairly local, but in case some people aren't, the wall itself is up on the top of the hillside there, but as far as you can see past the telegraph pole, or where the ridge is with the wood on the top of it there on the skyline, that's Hadrian's Wall over there. And like I say, we were built a few years earlier to guard the original Roman frontier up in the north of Britain, which was the Staingate Road that ran between modern Carlisle to the west of us, so about 35 miles in that direction, and a village called Corbridge, which is about 20 miles to the east of us over the back of Barkham Fell there. So that roadway was linking the 2 node points, and because there was a lot of trouble elsewhere in the eastern part of the empire and the troops were withdrawn from what they'd taken in Scotland, they set up a system of forts around about a half a day's march apart to guard the Staingate Road in around about 85 AD, and that was where Vindolanda first came into being as part of that defensive system. Now, since then we've worked out with the archaeology here from the earliest levels. Our first garrison were auxiliary soldiers. We've got the first cohort of Tungrians to begin with. That means we had 500 Belgians to be based here to start with. They only seem as if they lasted here for about 5 or 6 years before they were posted off to a different part of the frontier, and at that stage we had a big replacement garrison. We had the 9th cohort of Batavians that appear here. Now, if you'll indulge me for 2 minutes, my favourite characters in history. They're a Dutch tribe, those guys. They come from where the Rhine estuary empties into the North Sea in modern Holland, and they were so prized apparently by the Romans for their fighting ability that they were never taxed. Now, if you think about all of the tribes that Romans did conquer, that's a heck of an accolade, and apparently they had a great party piece. They were able to swim across open expanses of water in a full battle kit. This gives you a slight advantage to the kind of Royal Marines of the Roman army, I guess. So anyway, that's how we've got here based in our 2nd fort. Now, that garrison were 1,000 strong. So obviously the first fort, only built for 500 men, suddenly becomes redundant, and they knock it down, level the area up with big solid layers of turf and clay, which give them a solid platform on which to build again. They build a new wooden fort, lasts for about 10 or 15 years, the garrison changes, by which point the Tungrians come back again. They've been upgraded, so they're a little bit over 1,000 strong, so they knock the old fort down, they level it up with turf and clay, they build again. That goes for about 10 or 15 years, the garrison changes, and you get the idea. And so it's taken us sort of 25 years of work to sort of come to that sort of rough conclusion, and of course in the meantime in there, the site really sprang to prominence in world archaeology because we've got anaerobic conditions of preservation once we get down to around about fort number 6 and down over. So from around about 85 AD through to just before Hadrian builds the wall, we're lucky enough that all of our organic material still survives in the archaeology. So if I was to dig down deeper underneath these floors there, we'd get the wattle fences and the oak base beams and the painted wall plaster and everything still preserved in situ, along with anything made of leather. So for example, we found the world's largest collection of Roman shoes at the site. We've got about 5,500 of them now. You'll see the best 10% when you go down on display in the museum. And then best of all, in the early 1970s we turned up these written documents. We call them writing tablets for want of a better term, but essentially all they are little postcard sized scraps of wood, around about 1 millimetre in thickness, that have been written on in Latin in the old fashioned way with an iron dip and scratch pen. Now those things have absolutely revolutionised our understanding of the northern frontier, because it's a blurred divide with those between ancient history and historiographical accounts and the archaeology which is producing the history from its material culture, like the coins and the pottery and the ordinary finds that we get. So these tablets, they blur the boundaries a bit. So we get people's names, we get dates mentioned, we get places, and exactly what they thought about living up here. So you'll see loads of these when you go down into the museum down there, but I'll give you an example of one was my favourite, which was a little glimpse into what the Romans thought about the native Brits that they bumped into up here, my ancestors, and they were calling us the Britunculi. Well, that translates literally as the wretched little British. So, you know, not just have you got the pet name for us, but exactly what they thought about the guys up here as well. So just a little snippet. You'll see lots of these in the museum, and it gives you a window as to what sort of information is capable of being preserved on them. So of course, when we're getting those out of the ground, like I say, that took the focus of research for the last 25, 30 years. And as I say, we're back to where we are now in the early 1970s, looking at the later Roman period again. So the current project that we're involved with started about April the 1st last year, and it's called the Roman Frontiers in Transition Project. And what we're trying to look at is the discrepant identities of the different soldiers that lived at Vindolanda from its beginning in 85 AD right through to the very fall of the Roman Empire, where they're essentially turning back into being natives again. And we want to know who these guys are, where they're coming from, and really what kind of an experience they had as different troop types at different time periods on the northern frontier. Was it all the same experience? Was it just guarding Hadrian's Wall and the northern limes, or was it a bit more complicated than that? We think so. And so to do that, we split the dig into 3 different areas. So we've got a team from Western Ontario that have been working with us, and they're digging in the field just behind the tea sheds over there, the brown sheds, and they're looking at the really, really early Roman period. We did a radar survey in that field about 5 or 6 years ago, and it indicated that at a really deep level we had all sorts of well-buried features that we didn't know existed from there. So we've sent a little squad, no more than about 8 or 10 diggers over there to analyse that, to get a bit of a handle as to what was going on. And about a couple of years ago they got this big military defensive ditch from a fort that we didn't know anything about previous to them going into there. It had pre-Hadrianic coinage in the bottom of it, and it indicates that it's the south ditch of a fort that wasn't known about here, that's actually going a little bit further to the north. And given the date of it, we think it's possible that it might have been an original conquest fort. We've had a lot of research done on this in Hadrian's Wall in general in the last 10 years, and some of the guys that have been working at Carlisle have got a fantastic dendrochronology date, a tree ring date from one of the sill beams in the fort gateway over there that indicated that the timbers had been felled for use in around about 72-73 AD. Now, it probably doesn't sound too important to many people here, but it's actually really quite crucial up here on the northern frontier, because up till now everybody had worked out that it was Agricola, one of the really famous governors of Britain, that had taken the Roman troops north into what later on became Scotland in the early period. But if Carlisle have got it right, and we've got it right with our fort here, it might be it was a little few years earlier than that, which would mean it was a different governor of Britain, a chap called Petilius Cerialis, that was responsible for the original advance, and it happened maybe 2 or 3 years earlier than everybody had first worked out. So we've got the guys working on that over there. Sadly, the chap that's running the second dig is away on his annual holiday leave at the moment. You can see where he's been working. Right out in the village, the Vicus, beyond the fort walls there, we've got another bit sectioned off, and he's been analysing the early 2nd century material. So our Tungrians, then the Batavians, the Dutch and Belgian soldiers. He's digging essentially right in the middle of their fort. Because they're a bigger garrison, the fort's about twice the size. And what he thinks he's found in there, although it's all filled up with water with all the rain we've had this week, is he's got a lovely cobbled street called the Via Principalis, which runs right through the centre of the fort, and he's got a couple of really quite nicely preserved wattle fences and a decent section of flooring in there. So he's got one of the fort's main internal timber buildings as of yet we don't know which one it is. There's a little bit of evidence possibly for it being a hospital. There's the kind of thing you might pick up in the centre of a Roman fort, but to be honest with you, in a narrow little trench that he's had available, and bear in mind he's had to go down 3 or 4 metres to get to this, we haven't been able to establish exactly what the building's been used for yet, but he's certainly been having some fun. He's been in anaerobic condition, so we've got a couple of hundred shoes out of the ground over there. We've had 3 or 4 writing tablets this year as well, and then 1 or 2 other nice pretty finds. We've got a cavalry spur that I swear was in so good enough condition you could have bolted it onto a boot and used it today. 1 or 2 nice things as well. A phallic symbol that came out the other week that was hung on a pendant on somebody's neck. So the usual sort of scatter of artefacts that we're quite used to at the site. And then really this area is right at the very end of it. So what we're analysing in here are the later Roman garrisons. This is the 4th cohort Gauls, who were building the place in 213 AD, and then what happened in the 4th, and then finally the 5th century. So we've taken a whole quarter of the fort, so we've got the main roadway from the south gateway of the fort, where the guy in the wheelbarrow at the very end is coming at the moment, right the way up to the back of the headquarters building, which is just on your left hand side there. You're actually standing again on a main road that comes from the eastern gateway of the fort, just at the end of the barriers, right underneath your feet to link in with that in a T-junction. And essentially, as you can see, we've stripped all of this lot down to the barracks, the workshops, and probably some of the stables that we've got lying around underneath. And what we've found in here is that we've got 3 distinct building phases. One from 213 AD, when the 4th Gauls are building it. That's knocked down and somebody else has built a different set of buildings in the early 4th century, and then eventually when life and law and order is broken down at the very end of the Roman period, somebody in the 5th and 6th century has been building a couple of houses in here as well. So what I'm going to try and do now is just point the salient bits out. So if we start in the early 3rd century in 213, what we've got is what I think has been a cavalry barrack. So this wall that comes right down the front of the fence, right in front of you, is one of its walls. That's its very edge. As I say, you're on the roadway outside. It turns the corner here, so this wall that I'm standing on is its western gable end. It comes down to around about here and then turns the corner again. So when my jacket's on, you can see the wall going off, and then it runs underneath the later building that I'll explain a bit more about in a moment, and then underneath the untouched archaeology beyond there. Now, that's quite a narrow building. I've got to say, it's not all that big, but it's got clear room divides within it as well. So we've got walls like this one here, which butt joints onto that one. Comes right up and butt joints onto the one that I told you about at the start. And then, crucially for us, every so often we've got drains exiting the building like this one down there. So you can see the line of 3 or 4 stones on either side. They're just exiting about every couple of metres. We've got one of those, and it's just swishing straight outside onto the street. So you've got to be looking at why a building like that would need a whole number of drains. Now I know it's quite wet in Northumberland. I don't think it's anything to do with rainwater, bearing in mind it's got a roof on the top. Personally, I think that's probably been a stable or a cavalry barrack in there. That's been backed up by a lot of the evidence that we've had from the little bit of floor that we've excavated, early 3rd century in date, but we've also picked up quite a few horse harness fittings and bits of cavalry tack that have been lying around on the floor. We haven't gone too deeply into those floors just yet because we're still really analysing the 4th century material. So we've got one building there from the 3rd century. As I say, that's separated by a roadway straight outside, so if you just turn around and have a look behind you, you've got the gap in between the Praetorium there, the headquarters building and the commander's house just behind. That roadway where the grass is comes straight down underneath here, so I'm standing on its cobbled surface at the moment. And as I say, that goes underneath all this later material and out through the south gateway of the fort, and then we've got a secondary road, a sort of narrow back alley if you like, running down this way underneath these later walls to meet in with what's called the Intervallum Road, which is essentially a big ring road around the inside of the fort. So you've got the fort wall just beyond the grassy bank over there, you've got an earth embankment which you can still see with all the fine pebbles on, the ring road, and then you've got this one coming down the side. And if you look quite carefully, I don't know if you can see from there, can you see we've got a street side drain that's running around the edge through with capping stones in position on there. Now they would be good news because it's sealed the underlying material in the drain quite nicely, so we've taken endless soil samples out of those. The next stage with that is to put them through a flotation tank. Sounds dead complicated, archaeology is never complicated. It basically means you tip the bucket of soil into a big tank, pour water into it, swish it around with a wooden spoon, any plants and seeds float to the surface, they go over the overflow spout and through a fine sieve, and then you look at them through a microscope in the lab down there. Like I say, it's not rocket science archaeology, and hopefully when we do that we'll be able to work out what sort of plants and weeds and things were grown around the outside of the building, so that's part of the environmental sampling strategy. And then on the opposite side of that road we've got another barrack, or another stable, virtually identical in size and shape, and date to this one. So I'll just hop over the wall, you're able to see the wall that I'm standing on running down here. being its gable end, turns the corner and runs off down that direction, exactly parallel with that one. And if you have a look between the building behind you, that wall and that one there, they're all beautifully lined out, really classic Roman military planning. I mean, absolute dead straight line between them. So like I say, we haven't really got to delve too far down into their floors, but the drains and the cavalry bits probably indicate some kind of a stable or a cavalry barrack. Now at some stage those have been completely demolished, and in the early 4th century they've been replaced with a much bigger barrack, but on a completely different footprint. They haven't respected the old walls at all. So we've got, for example, just a rubble foundation of this one here coming down, runs all the way straight through the old western gable wall. You see how it's sliced through it there. Goes right down the corner here, turns there, which we've got to return all running down the middle, but that's not the south end of the building, that's just the apex of the roof, that's the central spine wall. On the opposite side, we just discovered about 2 or 3 days ago, turning around about here. So that's the width of the building. So if you compare it with the one that I've just described there, it's now 2 or 3 times the size. If you can imagine the sort of apex of the roof coming up here, and then you've got individual room divisions, similar to the other one made in stone, like this one here, which has blocked the old access to the roadway, sliced through the street side drain, sliced through the foundations of the original barrack, and then meets up with its northern wall over there. Now,